Andrea Leadsom, do you hope that if all goes well, that the Prime Minister can move faster than his roadmap that he's just set out?
I mean, the Prime Minister has said he'll be data-driven, and that's absolutely critical here. Obviously, there is a huge price to pay for lockdown and for all of these restrictions. And so, if the data surprises on the upside, as he has said, he will follow it. So I'm hoping, yes, that he may decide to release their restrictions sooner than expected.
So, but you do, unlike some of your colleagues, you do accept that at the moment, I mean, you're a former banker, it's pure mathematics, as the Prime Minister put it, that it's too risky to lift all the restrictions at the end of April once the vaccinations for the over 50s and the most vulnerable have taken effect.
Well, I would potentially do things a bit differently. I think, there isn't a perfect solution to the speed or the areas of restrictions that you lift. And certainly, I think that the Prime Minister's got it spot on to get schools back on day one as soon as possible, but also to allow others to have some communication with loved ones outside. But then the rest of it, the lifting of other restrictions, needs to follow the data. So if we do see a big turn down in the number of cases and hospitalisations, then I think we should be looking to lift restrictions sooner. So yes, it is mathematical, but I think we need to be optimistic and not allow the politics and I suppose in a way the fear of a possible additional lockdown to get in the way of lifting the restrictions as soon as we can.
Do you think that's what's going on here, that the Prime Minister has become fearful because of, having been bitten before on lockdowns?
I think there's a risk in the government that it has become incredibly difficult to keep going through this cycle of lifting restrictions and then locking down again. There's no doubt that that is very painful for ministers as well as for the economy. But at the same time, the respite that people had, for example, last summer, was incredibly valuable to them. And actually, for many, it was something of a lifeline. So I think it's just all in the balance. And as I say, there's no perfect solution, but I do hope that the Prime Minister will look very carefully at the data. And if it does look as though things are getting better faster than expected, he will actually lift the restrictions sooner.
You're doing this review into early years, so you have a keen interest in this area. What do you make of the fact that secondary school children are going to have to wear masks in the classroom? Does that bother you?
I think that is something that's still under review. I was in the chamber earlier when the Prime Minister made his statement, and in response to a question, he said it's going to be looked at very carefully. I mean, for some secondary school pupils, they won't mind in the slightest. For others, it will be, very intimidating or very unfriendly or whatever. So I think, it's got to be looked at in the round, but at the same time, we need to follow the science. And if it does really make a significant difference, then I guess it would be sensible, at least in the early days, to proceed with caution and have those face masks.
And just briefly, with your former business secretary hat on, would you like, or would you urge the Chancellor to extend that furlough scheme, given that hospitality indoors won't open until May the 17th, which is a month after those businesses start paying business rates and 2 weeks after the furlough ends as at present?
Well, the Prime Minister again said earlier today that he will not allow support to be withdrawn until the pandemic is over, in effect, until the restrictions are lifted, but to wait and see for the budget, which will be next week. So I think we should wait and see what happens there. But actually, one area I'm particularly concerned about is the impact of banks on businesses who've borrowed money from them, who've perhaps had to roll over quarterly interest payments, who are now staring down the barrel of being treated as a bad lender or a bad loan proposition by their banks. And that will have long-term consequences for them. So I do think that the government needs to look not just at support for businesses in the short term, but how businesses are going to be able to recover over the medium term once we've got, hopefully, this pandemic behind us.
Andrea Leadsom, thanks very much for joining us. Let's turn now to Neil O'Brien. You heard your colleague Andrea Leadsom there hoping that the Prime Minister can go faster. Given what a success the vaccine rollout has been so far, were you surprised that the Prime Minister wasn't a bit more boosterish?
No, I wasn't. And I agree with Andrea that we want to go as quickly as we possibly can, consistent with not having to go backwards, not having to lock down again, not having another flare-up of infections. And I think that it's right for that reason to take a cautious and prudent approach and to allow time, as Chris Whitty said earlier on in this program, to allow some time between opening up schools and then the next measure, so we can see what effect each of these different openings up is having, and we can do things in an orderly way and not have to go into stop, start, and going backwards, but to keep opening up and getting back to normal.
But given that amazing research on the fact that the jabs are so successful at preventing serious illness, potentially they've broken the link between case numbers and deaths, and yet case numbers, infection rates, is part of the government's 4 tests. Have the goalposts been moved by the scientists, do you think?
The goalposts haven't been moved by the scientists. The 4 tests are the same 4 tests that we had at the start of the year. What's clear is that the national lockdown has driven down cases a lot. It's great news that we have these great results today about the reduction in the number of hospitalizations that the vaccinations are leading to. And it's great that Britain is vaccinating faster than everywhere else in Europe. That's a great tribute to everyone in the NHS and the scientists who are behind this. So that's good news. But as the Prime Minister said earlier on, you still have the problem that it's not 100% protection. It's more like 75% reduction in hospitalizations. And there are still, sadly, some people, partly because of misinformation that's circulating online, some people are not getting the vaccination, even among older groups. For example, in London, last week's data showed there were still 10 to 20% of over 80 still not got the vaccination. And those people will be at risk if there is a flare-up in infections.
And so are you worried then by this SAGE modelling that suggests that at least a further 30,000 COVID-19 deaths would occur under the new scenarios, all the different scenarios that they modelled, even the most optimistic?
Well, we'll have to see what happens in terms of cases. They have come down very dramatically over the last couple of weeks. And what you're seeing today is a plan that is extremely cautious about avoiding unnecessary deaths and hospitalizations. We all desperately want to get back to normal as quickly as possible, want to see children back in schools. We want to see hospitality and shops opening up again. But this is a cautious plan that is, for exactly the reason you just set out, it's trying to minimize the number of unnecessary hospitalizations and deaths, even as we get back to normal. And it is good to finally have the light at the end of the tunnel and to know roughly when we're going to be getting back to normal, seeing friends and family, getting back down the pub, all the things that we enjoy doing in life. But at the same time, doing that in a way that is a one-way street, so we're just opening up and we don't get pushed back into kind of having to go backwards or having to lock down again.
And briefly, how do we treat coronavirus in future? Is it acceptable? As the Prime Minister said, you can't go for a zero COVID strategy. But do we have to try and minimise it to a tiny level like we do with measles?
Well, I was talking to a virologist about just that question the other day, and whether one can eliminate this thing altogether, I think is a good question. It's more likely that you have a kind of low COVID strategy rather than a no COVID strategy, because it is mutating as it moves around the world, and that's one of the reasons we've got to have strong health borders to avoid new variants of concern coming here. But at the same time, we can get cases down to a very low level through a combination of, firstly, the vaccination program and making sure that everyone gets vaccinated. And secondly, by not moving too quickly or too prematurely to have some kind of big bang reopening, which, although it's tempting looking, might just lead us back into further lockdown. So I think we've got the balance of risks about right here.